How about
yeah?
You can log out of that and then log back in. Don't tweet audio.
Yeah.
Is it okay now? Oh,
Let's see now.
yes.
Better now?
Okay.
Sorry.
So I should speak in the mic.
Well, I think it's just turned on now. Yeah. Okay. There you go. Sorry about that.
That's fine.
All right, so let me just start again. Because
Okay, let's start again.
So my apologies, everyone. I didn't realize the sound was not going to work properly. So once more, thank you for coming to our research seminar, Hong Kong Catastrophic Risk Research Seminar. Now, with sound that you can actually hear, our speaker for today is Dr. Ezechiel Thibaud from the Education University of Hong Kong, and she will talk to us today about her paper, Don't Tell Me What to Do, which is a Neorepublican critique of nudges. So, Ezechiel.
Thank you very much. Thank you, and hi again. Okay, so like I was saying, I've divided this talk in 4 parts. So the first part is going to be a definition of nudges and of the libertarian-paternalist argument for nudges, which is the main argument that proponents of nudges use. After I'll go over the justification for nudges and the way nudges are supposed to work, right? The mechanism that is behind nudges. And after that, I'll present the various problems that there are with this argument in particular and nudges in general, and the various risks that I think nudges pose. And finally, I'll give a brief review of my Neorepublican reading. Neorepublicanism is something I've been working on quite a lot. And I thought it would be interesting to wonder whether the concept of nudges is compatible with the Republican definition of freedom as non-domination. So I'll explain what that means later. So, okay. All right. So I know this is a center for catastrophic risk, so I've tried to make it relevant. I'm not going to talk about anything catastrophic, but I think it has to do with risks for two reasons. First, nudges are supposed to help us avoid certain risks. And this is the paternalistic aspect of nudges. They're supposed to help us minimize the risks of, for example, that have to do, for example, with the environment or climate change, or health problems or economic problems and so on. So that's the main goal when we use nudges. But what I argue is that by doing so, they themselves pose a certain risk or certain risks. And here I'm going to try to evaluate whether those risks are worth taking. And my main idea is that I don't think so, depending on the kind of nudge. For, well, a few reasons. First, I think the typical justification for the use of nudges is dissatisfying. So mainly because I think the argument is self-defeating, and also sometimes rely on some claims that I think are wishful thinking claims. Second, I think that nudges may pose bigger risks than the risk they are trying to avoid. Because they may undermine our very capacity to actually address those risks in the first place by creating a form of moral atrophy, which I'll explain. And finally, I think the risks that are being avoided by nudges, or that we try to avoid by the use of nudges, are of a systemic nature that nudges fail to actually fix, because nudges are only a superficial solution to these very deeply rooted and systemic problems. And I think because of that, they may actually cause more long-term harm, even when they're benevolent. Okay, so let's start with the definition of nudges. So, well, the concept of nudges has been popularized by Thaler and Sunstein in a book called Nudges in 2008. And they're the biggest proponents of the concept, and they really think that nudges can solve a lot of our problems in most societies, at least. They define nudges as such. They say it's any aspect of the choice architecture that alters people's behavior in a predictable way, without forbidding any options or significantly changing their economic incentives. More recently, Sustein wrote a paper, so it's actually very recent, where he said nudges are private or public initiatives that steer people in particular directions, but that also allow them to go their own way. Okay? So basically, nudges are tools that gently influence people's choices without any coercion and without restriction. So this is something you've experienced very regularly in your life, actually. You might not be aware of that, but nudges are really everywhere around us. What's important to understand about them is that they're not mandates. They're not things that will force people, right? So they're not powerful enough to do that. They also don't really remove any options. That's quite important. They only affect how accessible options are. And well, usually they make the undesired options less accessible than the desired options. So that's basically the idea behind it. But they don't remove the undesired option. Another condition is that nudges, the influence of the nudge must be easily avoidable. And I'll talk about that in more details because it's actually a very important condition. And then they are more or less transparent. Sometimes it's very evident that there's a nudge, and sometimes it's not very clear. They can also be benevolent or not benevolent, right? I'll show you pictures to illustrate what I'm talking about. So these are all nudges. I'm sure you're quite familiar with at least the bottom ones, if you've tried to buy anything online ever. So the would you like to proceed? You know, usually when you're trying to buy a plan and the company wants you to buy that plan or that product or whatever, the yes button is going to be very clear. You know, you really want to click that, and the no is going to be very small and, you know, not very attractive. So you're most likely to say yes. This one is also very popular when you try to buy like a phone plan or something like this. They'll tell you which one is the most popular, right? Because that's going to influence you to get it. We assume that this is the one that is the most beneficial for the company itself, right, to sell you. So these are non-benevolent nudges, or at least if they're used for commercial purposes, we think they're not very benevolent. At least they're not trying to solve common good problems, right? They're trying to sell something. There's another example when, for example, you go to a famous fast food chain, and they ask you if you want to supersize your meal. You're more likely to say yes if they ask you than to ask for it in the first place without them asking you anything, right? So that's also a nudge. Right. On the top, you have more benevolent nudges. So the first one could be, for example, on the left. In a school, maybe. So this is trying to influence people into exercising more, moving more, not taking the escalator and taking the stairs instead. And this one I think is quite funny. It's well, trying to make you use as little paper as you can because you feel guilty. Because of your use of paper, the Amazonian forest is dying, right? So maybe that's a bit clear. You also have things such as supermarket designs where you have fruits and vegetables at the entrance, and it's very clean and nice looking, and then beer and chips are at the very back of the store. That's also a form of nudging. All right, so here you see clearly the difference between nudges that try to solve problems that we consider real problems that concern everybody, and nudges that can be used to buy something else. Anyway, so here I'm mostly going to talk about benevolent nudges, not only, but mostly. My claim is that there are some evident problems about non-benevolent nudges, but I think there are also problems with benevolent nudges. Anyway, Thaler and Sustein are big proponents of benevolent nudges. So these are nudges that aim at reducing risks of commonly considered bad outcomes. Whether these outcomes are for individuals, so that could be lack of saving, you know, when it's hard to save for retirement, hard to save for your insurance, or whatever that is, poor food choices, etc. Or that you know, risks that concern society in general, so public health, climate change, and so on. So one of the first things they say to justify it is that neutral choice architecture is impossible. So what they'll say is every time you make a decision, it's always oriented by something, whether you are aware of it or not, right? So it's impossible to avoid orientation, and because of this, we may as well propose a good form of orientation, right? And this is what benevolent nudges are supposed to provide. So the main idea that they have is that nudges will direct people toward the choices that they would make if they were fully rational, right? And there's many reasons they might fail to make those choices, and mostly it's because they either lack discipline or they lack willpower, or they're completely ignorant about what is best for them to choose, or it could be also a form of acrasia, which is to choose against your best interest. So that happens. We know that happens. That happens to us all the time. And the idea here is that if that happens to you, and when that happens to you, you could use a nudge to motivate you a little more. Maybe you don't drink enough water every day, and every day you're like, oh, I wish I would think of drinking water. Then you might want to install an app on your phone that reminds you to drink water every hour or something like that. Right. So that's the idea behind it. Now, what they say, what seems to be the most surprising argument, they're saying that nudges are libertarian and paternalistic at the same time. So that seems to be an oxymoron, obviously, because, well, as we know, the justification for paternalism seems to be conflicting with the justification for libertarianism. So what they'll say, so the typical justification for libertarianism, for paternalism, is that people sometimes fail to identify their own good, whether personal good or good for society. And when that's the case, whoever knows what their good is morally permitted to impose it, even if that involves some restriction of freedom. Right? And this is what you do with children, for example. Right? Now, of course, there's a condition, and it is that the interest of the people who are subject to that restriction must actually be pursued. Right? So that's paternalism. Now, the typical libertarian claim would be something like people's negative freedom should be as minimally restricted as possible. And when such restriction happens, it should never happen based on people's good. So Mill, for example, has such argument when he talks about the harm principle. He says the only justification for restricting people's freedom is if their action is going to cause harm, but it can never be because it's their own good. Right? So he's very opposed to the paternalistic claim. Okay, so on paper, these two things should not go together. But Thaler and Sustein conflate the two. So I don't know if they do it successfully, but at least they try. So what they say is that nudges allow us to do this because first, people are left free to make their own choices and they're free to reject any situation that no longer serves them. But at the same time, choice architects can influence people's behavior as long as this serves their interest. But it is all based on the idea that you can resist the influence of the nudge, right? That it's not coercive. So they say libertarian paternalists want to make it easy for people to go their own way. They do not want to burden those who want to exercise their freedom. And what they argue is that nudges actually provide a real third option between, obviously they're writing in the American context, so between liberals and conservatives. And they argue that those small changes can have massive effects on people's behavior, and that because of them, we can solve actually a lot of problems. Okay, so that's for the definition. Now, here's how they justify the use of nudges. The first one is an assumption of irrationality on the side of agents. So what they say is people naturally lack rational capacities or are often incapable of rational choices. So there's basically three conditions for that, for the use of nudges in that case. So first, there should be a decisional irrationality to begin with. So people should be unable to make rational decisions for any reason. It has to be the case that people fail to recognize their own good and act according to it, or act according to it. Sometimes you do recognize your own good, but you just find it very hard to do anything about it. And third, another thing that that fuels their argument is that people are naturally prone to biases and fallacious thinking, quick thinking, and all kinds of things like this. So because of this, they argue people can need a little assistance. They could use a little help with decision making. They also say something that is a little surprising, but they're saying that people are hardly educable. These rational skills are not really cultivable, at least when people are adults, right? So they're not really talking about children, although there are a lot of talks about the use of nudges in education. I'll talk about it a little bit. But they're mostly concerned with adults. And what they say is that either people have natural limitations that we can't really do anything about, and we should just be satisfied with it, or people are very busy. they literally just say that. They say people live very complex and busy lives, and they don't have time to consider every option and think of, evaluate the possibilities, the outcomes, and so on. No, they need help in making quick decisions that will have a good outcome. Right? Okay, so that's one justification. Now, about the mechanism. So what they say is that nudges, well, basically they have this concept of system 1, system 2 cognitive mechanism. I don't know how accurate this is, but they claim that the brain works this way, right? So I'm not a neuroscientist. I have actually no idea if this is true, but this is what they say. So basically, we should have a system 1, which is the most automatic system. So this is every time you make, decisions that are very quick, where you don't really think about them, and they're not really rationally justified. And all the things such as gut feelings come from system 1, right? And then you have your system 2, which is the reflective system. When you actually deliberate, you evaluate your options, you rationally justify your choices, and it's slower, takes more time, and so on. Nudges are very clearly triggering system 1 mechanisms, right? And they're doing so because they're supposed to generate a very quick response. And the way they do it is by taking advantage over assumed natural tendencies to use system 1 more often or more easily than system 2. The fact that we refer to system 1 more is the reason nudges are supposed to trigger this one. So basically, and this is what makes proponents of nudges argue that it's okay to take advantage of people's cognitive vulnerabilities, the fact that they're prone to biases and quick thinking and so on. But if we do this, we have to do this to orientate them in the right direction, basically. So if people's rational deficiency is either natural or unchangeable, then it's acceptable to take advantage of those vulnerabilities at the condition that it serves people's interests, right? So this is clearly what they're saying. They're saying, well, you're prone to biases, so that's not going to change. So we're just going to help you to make better choices based on this very mechanism, which is you being prone to biases. Obviously, it raises a lot of questions. First, but I don't really know how accurate this system 1, system 2 is. And it's also very hard to know how to, draw a clear line between the two. I don't know if, it works really like this. Sometimes it could be that a decision is made with a mix of both, or something a bit more nuanced. And then, of course, it raises questions related to autonomy, which I'll talk about also later. But typically, when we think of autonomous decision, we think it relies more on system 2 mechanisms than system 1. So there's a lot of literature on that. Now, about the moral conditions for nudges. So what makes it morally permissible to use nudges? So there's 3 conditions that are raised by Sagai. I hope I say his name correctly. He says basically, first, the irrational behavior of the agent must be predictable, right? It must be predictable, and it must display certain regularities. It must be something that happens regularly. And it also must produce a negative outcome for the nudgee. Obviously, if the outcome is positive, if the person recognizes it as positive, then there's no problem. There's no need for a nudge. Second, the choice of the choice architect, so the person who designs the nudge, must be objectively better for the nudgee than the choice that they would have made themselves. Right? And third, the nudges must be easy to resist. So I'll stop a little bit on this one. And this is what I've called the resistibility condition. And this is what makes the difference between nudges and mandates or laws, right? So the fact that they're non-coercive. So for example, a red light is not a nudge, because if you stop, you stop at the red lights because you're forced to. You're forced to either because you're, you know that if you go, you might get into an accident, or you might get caught and pay a fine. There's bad consequences for that you fear in a certain way, and that stops you from doing it. Anyway, it's clearly a law. It's clearly forbidden. You shouldn't do that. So that's coercive. That's not a nudge. Now, for a nudge to remain non-coercive, a nudge must be easy to resist. Right? It must be easy to be influenced by a nudge and say, okay, I'm not going to, I know I'm being nudged here, and I refuse to act this way. I'll do otherwise. Right? And there are 3 conditions for resistibility. So first, agents must be aware that there's some influence exercised on them. Second, they must be capable of resisting the influence, so resisting those impulsive actions, which are supposed to be triggered by the nudge. And these 2 must be relatively effortless, right? So that you should not have to fight to resist the nudge. Right? You shouldn't have to fight to go buy chips in the supermarket instead of fruit, right? So that should be very effortless. So because your capacities as a rational agent must be stronger than the trigger of the nudge. Right? Okay, so that is for that condition. And I'll explain later that this is where I think there is a self-defeating issue. Finally, proponents of nudges also argue that nudges are basically good because they're more acceptable and they're more welcomed than other measures, like taxation, for example, which is also a mandate, it's something you have to pay, and that often people don't like to pay. And this is not something that's particularly welcomed. And what they say is nudges seem to be very welcome because they are barely perceptible, precisely because of this. Right? It's because it's their lack of transparency that makes them accepted by society in general. So what they'll say is that because they're barely perceptible and therefore welcomed, then they are more likely to produce the desired outcome without any resistance. But obviously, it's unclear whether they're more accepted because they are imperceptible or because they're recognized as beneficial. Right? It's quite unclear. Maybe people are just not aware that they exist. Right? It's not necessarily that they recognize it and they approve. Right? Okay, so this is for how they work and how they're justified. Now, let's talk about a few issues that that people have raised about them. So there's many, there's a lot of literature on that, but I've just focused on what I thought was the most important. So first, there's a problem with the assumed authority of the choice engineers, right? So who gets to make a nudge? Who designs a nudge? Who is this person who knows better than everyone? It's not necessarily a person, obviously, but who are these agents that are good at making those rational decisions that we are not good at making? So the choice engineer is either naturally good at making rational decisions or trained, right? So they're experts. We call them experts. They're educated. But the idea of experts kind of undermines the initial claim that people are not or are hardly educable. But yeah, the question is left open. Thaler and Sustein don't really answer that one. So that's the first problem. Second, I think there could be a problem with the assumption of prima facie irrationality. So the fact that we just assume people to be irrational in the first place. So I think that could be a case of wishful thinking. I don't know if it's wishful, but I don't know if we have enough evidence for that one, at least not enough to allow us to build public policies based on this premise. Because, well, we know there are irrational choices that are made, right? but it's not necessarily an indication that we are naturally essentially irrational, right? There could be multiple reasons that we make irrational choices. It doesn't have to be a natural component of human decision making, right? But this is the way it is presented, and this is the way it's used. Right? So I think that there could be a problem with this one. Then about the resistibility condition that I talked about. So as we know, nudges must meet this condition. But this condition itself requires rational skills, right? It requires at least the capacity to identify the nudge and to resist the nudge based on your previously identified preferred option, right? But as we know, the need and justification for nudges rely on assumed poor decision-making skills, the fact that we're not very rational. In fact, Sustein himself said recently that it could be the case that nudges work better when people are unaware of them. So the less transparent, the better, he says. So I think there's potentially a paradox here. It is a contradiction between the fact that we justify nudges because we're not rational enough, but at the same time, they need to be resistible, which requires some rational skills. So there's a problem in saying nudges trigger shallow processes, cognitive processes, and at the same time, they're supposed to be easily resistible. So, so I think that's actually one of the main issues with that specific argument. Now, there's another big problem when it comes to autonomy. So there are debates about whether nudges impact autonomy. I don't know if it does, but at least it doesn't help, right? So as we know, nudges are based on system one mechanisms, if such systems exist. So they tackle quick responses, they exploit biases, and so on. But autonomy, when we think of autonomy or self-mastery, self-government, and so on, usually we think of system two mechanisms, right? You know, if you remember Frankfurt and his famous volition, second order volition claim, so autonomy or free will, he would call it free will, but there's the capacity to form second order volitions on first order desires, which is a reflexive thing, right? You need to think of your desires, you need to reflect on them, and you need to willingly endorse them, basically. So that's very different from anything that has to do with system one. So I don't know if nudges actually impair autonomy, but it doesn't improve it, right? Or at least it doesn't have anything to do with it, which could itself be a problem. Now, it's another debate, but it could be the case that to invest in policies that don't aim at helping us being more autonomous, it could be an issue. Right? If you think of education, for example, we think the goal of education is precisely this. And so, well, I'll talk about it later, but it could be in itself an issue that we don't focus on that first. Right? So that's one possibility. Now, I think there actually could be problems regarding a form of moral atrophy. The fact that nudges might impair rational skills because they provide an assistance to our decision making, which would lead to, in the long term, an incapacity to make decisions by ourselves. So we don't really know if that's the case, because we don't have a lot of long-term studies on nudges because it's a very new thing. But I think it's a risk worth considering. So I'm using the analogy of a knee sleeve. If you have a bad knee and you put a sleeve on it, it might help for a little bit. But if you leave that sleeve on for months, your knee is going to atrophy, your muscles are going to atrophy, and eventually your knee won't be, you know, you won't be able to use your knee the way you were. So I wonder if there's a similar phenomenon for a rational decision making, and if nudges actually provide too much assistance, if it becomes too comfortable. So, and I'm not the only one saying that. Osman and Welsh have said that the risk for, there is a real risk for autonomous decision-making capacities no matter how well-intentioned the nudge can be. They're talking about this mostly in the context of education. And then it's a little bit of a different argument, but Waldron wrote a paper which was quite direct critique of nudges, and he is quite radical. He says nudges actually affect our dignity, our human dignity. He says that he makes a conscious argument against nudges, saying nudges take advantage of my deficiencies in the way one indulges a child. So he says actually to rely on nudges is actually to violate your human dignity, your autonomy, and to not consider your moral worth, basically. Okay, so that's about the frame of autonomy. I wanted to talk a little bit about education. I've done a little bit of research on this, on nudges in education specifically, to see if, we actually had evidence that there are effects in one way or another from nudges. So basically, there are mixed results when it comes to the effects of nudges in education, mostly heterogeneous effects. So it was often the case that, for example, when you use a nudge in a classroom, motivation was increased, but students didn't necessarily understand what to actually do to get better performances. So they could, for example, you have a lot of nudges that aim at comparing results, right? And that comparison is supposed to motivate students to do better. Now, it could be that they're more motivated, but then they don't really know how to do better. So if that's the case, it's unclear what the real effect is. Generally, what people have said, there's kind of a pattern of concern where people say nudges tend to exacerbate existing inequalities between students by only benefiting those who are already advantaged. Another big issue is that we only have access to short-term effects. And nudges do only provide long-term effects, at least according to these scholars, which they say is maybe not incompatible, but at least very different from the goal, what should be the goals of education, which is a long-term process. We look at long-term processes when we look at education. We don't just look at quick results and quick performances, right? We want to make sure students learn something that they continue, well, they get skills that they continue to use throughout their lives. So there is a little bit of a problem here. Now, and again, most of the time nudges are evaluated in education based on performances and not on processes. So it could be that performances are slightly better for any reason because of the nudge, but that the process through which we got those results is not well, it could be anything, right? It could be that, for example, because of a nudge that compares results, you got more motivated to do better, and maybe you cheated or something like this, right? So the process is not really checked, right? And we don't really have access to whether the nudge has an effect on that. But the goal of education is actually to check on processes, not just results, right? We don't just want performances, we want to know how we got those performances, right? Anyway, so that leads me to basically the last big problem I have with nudges, which is the short-termism of them, and the fact that we don't really know if the effects last after the nudge is removed, and how long it lasts. So as I've said, we only see short-term effects or no effect at all sometimes. This is an accusation that Sustein tried to reject. So he recently said that nudges are actually very effective because they are cost effective, right? Because they're quite cheap. It means that per dollar, they achieve more than any other result. Now, I don't think it's a very good argument, because this is only relevant if you're only interested in saving costs, right? If you're only interested in saving money, but it's not necessarily the case, especially when we look at big issues such as climate change, public health, and so on. Now, I've anticipated an objection, which would be, but nudges were never meant to solve all world's problems, which is true, fair enough. However, I don't think the problem is about that. I don't think just because they can't solve everything, we should reject them. So it's not about their limitation. It's more about what they detract us from by being there. So my issue is that if we rely on them too much, if we rely on the small and short-term changes that they might produce, we could then be stopped from investing on more structural changes, things that would be more costly, more long-term, but eventually more important. To me, nudges are a little bit of a band-aid solution, right? It's not really something that's going to cure the disease. It's only going to fix a very superficial problem. And if we only focus on that, we might not look at the real issue, the root cause of the issue. And so there's been a few critiques in that direction. So Schmidt and Angelen say that the worry is that nudges do little to address the underlying socioeconomic causes of many of the social ills we encounter. So, for example, they talk about obesity. They say, well, it would be a mistake to think it's only a result of decision-making, right? It's a multi-layered problem. It's multifaceted. And if we only look at the superficial aspects of it, we're not really going to go very far. Others, like Leggett, for example, have argued that nudges serve a neoliberal agenda. So by neoliberal, they mostly mean an agenda that aims at saving costs as much as possible for public issues. So he says, while nudges provide useful insights concerning the interface between the agent and their immediate physical environment, it neglects how that environment is itself a historical product. And finally, I think if nudges are a project, like a social project, something that we want to rely on, I think it sends the message that we're basically just okay with people having a lack of rational decision-making skills. And we're just okay with quick fixes. I think it indicates a lack of ambition regarding what we could be doing, what agents could be doing. And it kind of sends the message that we've given up. Okay, we're prone to biases. We're not very good thinkers. That's fine. We don't really want to get better. We just need a little help, right? Because eventually we still want a good outcome. So I think it shows a lack of ambition that is itself problematic. If nudges are used as a, if we rely on them to solve our problems, I'm not saying we can't use them sometimes for some things, but if this is the main thing we use, I think it's a problem. Okay, so this is for the review of the various issues I have and other people have with it. Now, about the Neorepublican reading, I'll try to be brief. Now, I wanted to ask whether nudges are compatible with the Neorepublican concept of freedom as non-domination. Okay, so freedom as non-domination is a definition of freedom that comes initially as a rejection of liberal freedom, which is freedom as non-interference. Obviously, when I talk about Republican, I just want to make it clear, I don't talk about the American Republican Party, right? I talk about a school of thought in political philosophy, right? It has nothing to do with this. But so basically, the liberal definition of freedom, which is, something that comes from maybe Locke or Mill, and later on Isaiah Berlin, John Rawls, etc., says that basically freedom is the absence of interference Okay. What Neorepublicans and especially Philippe Petit have said is that this definition is both too narrow and too broad. It's too narrow because it is possible that one suffers no interference at all, but is still unfree. So he has this famous example of a slave who would have a benevolent master. So the master would never interfere with the slave, but the slave is still unfree because they are a slave. And that's precisely because the master could interfere at any moment, right? Even if they never do it. So it's possible to have no interference and still be unfree. On the other hand, one can be the subject of interference and remain free. So if you stop at the red lights, you're still free. I mean, at least your freedom is not restricted in a significant way, right? Right. So what they say, they suggest that we change this definition, and they say unfreedom is the absence. Freedom is the absence of arbitrary interference with what they call domination. Whether that interference is actual or possible, which solves the slave problem. Now, so this is freedom as non-domination. What do they mean by arbitrary interference? So the condition of non-arbitrariness means that for an interference to be arbitrary, it must not track the benefits and interests of those who are subjected to it. Right? So it's basically an interference that's based on the interest of the person who's interfering. Okay. Now, the link with nudges. So if nudges are not transparent, that can be an issue for checking that arbitrariness condition. And that's the difference with laws and mandates, which are transparent. So there's very little control one can have on the non-arbitrariness nature of nudges, especially if they are used, for example, for commercial purposes, as we've seen, right? We don't really think about that. It's not very clear. If we start thinking about it, it becomes clear, but maybe you have lived your entire life and you've only realized this today. You know, it makes it difficult to track the intention of the nudger. And if we can't track the intention of the nudger, we can't check whether it's arbitrary or not. Right? So my conclusion on that is that non-benevolent and non-transparent nudges might be incompatible with freedom as non-domination. Now, if we think of benevolent nudges, I think there could be a problem with them as well, because the issues regarding moral atrophy remain. Now, that would be a longer conversation, and I think it would be an interesting one to have, but basically, nudges are not an information tool. It's not something that teaches you anything. It's not something that improves your decision-making, as we've seen. It's something that really encourages passivity. Okay? And that proponents of nudges actually endorse. They say, yes, because you don't have time to make those decisions, we'll help you. But if you think of republicanism as a political philosophy, and it's an old political philosophy, it's something that goes, well, that started maybe with Aristotle and then continued with Cicero, Machiavelli, Rousseau, and so on. It's a very rich tradition, which really focuses on encouraging active participation and you know, information for citizens. So here you can wonder whether there is a compatibility problem. Also, freedom as non-domination is a long-termist conception of freedom, and it's a very demanding conception. And I think it's too demanding for us to be satisfied with nudges only. So it requires, freedom as non-domination requires that we have sufficient information about ourselves, about our own interests, about our options, that we enjoy a form of positive freedom, which we can also call self-government or self-mastery or autonomy, which is the capacity to do certain things. That we also have adequate regulations to make sure other people don't interfere with this arbitrarily, and so on. So it's I don't think that even if the nudge isn't ill-designed, it's a tool that's very compatible with the ideal Republican society, at least in the way that these writers were describing it. Now, the main issue, I think, is not to use nudges in general, but it would be to rely on them for important public decisions. And precisely because it might allow us to neglect the things that would actually be needed, such as, you know, ambitious public reforms, education, and so on. So I think the risk is to create disempowered agents who wouldn't be able to identify their own interests or substantially engage with the community, which is also one of the requirements of republicanism. So as a conclusion, I know I've been very long, nudges are tempting because they're quick, they're cost effective, they're very noticeable, and they're very welcomed. And they're a good way to avoid some public risks, on paper at least. But I think that because of their inherent mechanisms, their long-term effect can only be limited, if not harmful. So what I've tried to do here is to advocate for a form of nudge caution. I'm not saying we should eliminate all nudges, and it's also not something that's realistic because they're around and there's nothing we can really do about it. But I think we should use them wisely. And I think the use of them must be regulated to make sure we don't, to make sure that they remain benevolent, first of all, that they remain as transparent as possible. And I also think we need to make sure we don't rely on them too much. Relying on them is, I think, a risk in itself, because it would allow us to neglect the systemic root causes of the problems we're trying to fix and provide sustainable solutions. Okay, so this is a bit of few reference, and this is my talk. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much to Ezechiel for that fascinating talk. We're going to do some Q&A now. Apologies again for the technological mishap, so we're going to try and make sure that doesn't happen in the future. When you're asking your questions, how about we try to project our voices so that people on the Zoom call can hear, because I know in past talks, and we've had them online, it's been very hard to hear people's questions, basically. So whoever has a question, just raise your hand.
Yeah, maybe this one.
Thanks a lot for the talk.
You're welcome.
Yeah, so I guess my question is about claim you made at one point that you at least couldn't see how nudges could enhance our autonomy. So maybe they don't perish, but it's hard to see how they enhance. I guess I was thinking of at least some paradigm cases of nudges seem like on some conception of autonomy that they might give them against our autonomy. So there's the famous example of having people opt out versus opt in to like a retirement savings plan.
Yeah.
I think you can make a case where, depending on how you understand autonomy, that by nudging people to save for retirement, you're actually enhancing their autonomy, because most people have a Frankfurtian second order desire. You know, people desire to save for retirement. They just are really bad at it. And so by nudging people to opt into a retirement savings plan, it seems like you're actually, in most cases, helping people act in a more coherent way. They have this higher order sense, I really ought to retire. And then when it comes to the job, they don't do it. And so isn't that an instance where the nudge might actually enhance people's autonomy by getting them to do what, not just what other like outside experts think they ought to do.
What they
people themselves think they ought to do.
So that's a good question. I think this is precisely what Sustein would say, I don't, and this is where I think he thinks it's fine to have some level of paternalism. It doesn't necessarily conflict with autonomy. And here it's what you're doing. You're saying, well, you want this, so I'll help you get this, right? It's not based on what I think, it's based on what you think. I don't know if this is true. I don't know if you, but then we go into definitions of autonomy. So I don't know if I really first agree with Frankfurt. I don't know if this definition is sufficient. I don't know if you're really enhancing their autonomy while you're doing this. What you could argue is that you're enhancing their future autonomy, because once they have saved enough, then they can start living the life they want, basically, something like this. A little bit like if your parents forced you to study hard for school and you hated it at first, but now that you have and you're able to have a good job, then you're happy they did, because now you feel like you're empowered. And so I think there could be a case for that. It could be enhancing future you autonomy, but I don't know if it actually is enhancing present you autonomy. But I think it really is debatable because it relies on the definition of autonomy you want to have. Yeah. But I think there are some paternalistic conceptions of autonomy. But yeah, I don't know if I personally agree with that. I don't think, or at least it's not, it might not be incompatible with your autonomy, but I still don't think it enhances it if you still rely on the assistance of the nudge to make that decision. I think ideally you should be able to make it yourself. So yeah, I still don't really feel like it's helping. It might not be harmful, but I don't think it's really helping if someone helps you making that decision. I don't,
Yeah. I mean, you can also have just another notion of autonomy where it's more like you're more autonomous as far as you have more power to achieve.
Yeah. Yeah.
In which case, like a lot of nudges would increase your autonomy because they just are power.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's actually possible. But I think it's still, it's a kind of a second order form of autonomy. It's like you're not autonomous in the moment, but you're gathering all the necessary conditions for you to be autonomous eventually, something like that. Which is not incompatible. Yeah. Okay.
Thanks very much. I was gonna ask about something else, but I so I'm just wondering, like, we can have a debate about which version of autonomy or what theory of autonomy we ought to prefer. But as someone who was just persuaded by the idea of, like, well, people want to be saving money. They want, they want to be saving for money. They want to be saving for retirement. Now it's just that people are busy, they have a lot of things going on, so they don't think to do it or whatever. And so this is helping them achieve their aims, and in a way that's still easy for them to opt out of. It's not like they require anything. So I'm just wondering what kind of view about autonomy would it take to say that this is not conducive to their autonomy? It's opt out.
Yeah.
Like what would they like the Republican perhaps alternative be that would say this isn't non-coercive?
Yeah, I think so Republicanism doesn't really have a definition of autonomy, which was actually the topic of my PhD. I tried to give one. They don't really focus on, they're not, I mean, Neorepublicans are not very focused on this. From a more ancient Republican definition, like Aristotle or Cicero, it would be, it's very much linked to your participation in the political community and the capacity to make laws and the capacity to take turns in making political decisions. So it's a very political definition. It's not really something we're satisfied with today because, you know, of the nature of our societies, which are much larger than Roman society or Greek society. I think there might be an issue here with the fact that people are too busy to make decisions that are good for them or to follow those decisions. Like, why is it that we live in such a world where people identify they're good and still they fail to act accordingly because of external things? Not just because of a lack of willpower. Let's assume it's not a lack of willpower, it's that they're literally too busy. They have other things in mind. I think there's an issue here. I think this itself is an impediment on people's autonomy somehow. The fact that they don't live in an environment that is conducive to them pursuing their own self-identified good. And I guess an idealistic Republican view would be to fix that first, maybe, to give enough time for people. Actually, if you think of the Greeks, it's exactly what they do. So the ideal Greek citizen is someone who has time to talk about philosophy, to, you know, talk about politics and do all kinds of things, then make a good life, right? So I think it would probably be something akin to that, addressing the cause of you know, your lack of capacity in the first place. Now that since you're already in this situation and you need help, yeah, I mean, it depends also on the kind of nudge. I think there are nudges, some nudges are more acceptable than others when it comes to that. If it's a nudge that you decide, for example, you install something on your phone to help you with certain things that you want to do, I think that impairs your autonomy less than, you know, some commercial nudge or something that you're not aware of. So yeah, I'm also not judging all nudges the same. I think there are significant differences here. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, I think
yeah. Generally, I think nudges show, well, the reliance on nudges show a lack of ambition on how things could be, but not just for individuals, but also in general, the kind of environment we create for people to make decisions, actually. And we don't ask ourselves those questions. Why is it that we're too busy? Why is it that we can't do that? Or that we don't have time or energy to do this? You know, and I think to rely on nudges allows us to stay in this position. But it's a bigger conversation.
Clarifying question about that's partly answered now, but like one of the kind of controversial claims that you're
me?
Yeah, because like so you on one hand you think that nudges sometimes like
I'm not saying good, I'm saying not as harmful. I mean, yeah, I guess sometimes they can be. For example, this one, well, other photos. I don't think the ones on top are harmful, right? I think I don't know if they're good. They're not bad. So, yeah, the insurance or the retirement plan.
Like at least giving certain background situations,
yeah.
Like trying to bring that in. And as a result, a lot more people have, you know.
Yeah, no, it's not necessarily a bad. No, it's not a bad thing. I don't think it's a bad thing to do, but I don't think it's a good thing to do according to a certain situation, based on a certain situation, in a certain situation, which is the situation most people are in now. But I don't think ultimately it's the best situation. I think it's to try to minimize damages instead of actually making sure everyone has a pension that is, you know, that works for them. So given that we live in an environment where it's difficult to make those decisions, for all the reasons, various reasons. We minimize damages by using nudges, but which is not harmful itself. But I think the potential problem comes with, again, relying on that and being satisfied with this only, instead of providing good pensions or a saving system that works for everybody. That maybe there's an MPF system, for example, where we just have to save every month. So we don't have to rely on the nudge to do that.
Sounds like you're saying that, yeah, you have real well. Nudges can be good. It would be better.
Yeah, basically.
Brilliantly.
Yeah. Yeah.
With a huge amount of detail and like how.
Yeah. Yeah, so they are, but I'm cautious of them because they are very convenient and cheap, and I'm cautious again on just being satisfied with them, right? Only. I said I think they work like a band-aid. You don't want to just be satisfied with the band-aid if you have like a very bad wound that's getting infected and whatever. You want to actually treat the problem, right? So the fact that nudges are so widely accepted, I think could potentially be risky, because that it allows us not to look at the real issue. Mm. Yeah.
What's the kind of like, what's the real issue there?
Well, for example, I think they're talking about the American system. I don't know exactly how it works, but I think you need to basically invest for your retirement throughout your life. It's not the case everywhere, right? In many other places, you pay certain taxes every month, and eventually all these taxes are collected. They calculate how much you can make for retirement, and then you get your retirement money back. But it's not an investment. That money was never invested on the market. It was just a tax you paid, which was able to pay for the current retirement of people who are retired. And then you get it back when you retire. So, I mean, there are other ways to fix the problem of pensions, right? I feel like we're talking about the French problem that is going on right now. So I'm not going to explain how we can pay for retirement pensions, but well, the nudge that helps people saving for that could be made unnecessary if we found another way to pay for people's pension, a more sustainable way. Depending obviously on the nudge, yeah. But for example, I mean, the escalator stairs thing, I think it's not harmful at all. Actually, I think it's quite a nice nudge. It's pretty fun. I don't really see the harm here. But in a lot of cases, if nudges are used to avoid thinking of another solution, which would be more stable, more sustainable, then I think that's an issue. It's not an issue. It's not necessarily an issue itself, but the reliance of it on it is, I think. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Rely on nudges, you don't want to have to win for elements. They seem kind of unavoidable situations, no matter how you set things out. That seems like it would be really bad for you. They just have to be there. So I'm thinking like, you can either opt in America, you can either opt into organ donation or opt out.
Mm-hmm.
That's the default. Maybe if you don't like that, maybe you want a choice, circle yes or no. But even then, like how that's presented, if the yes comes first or later, that's a nudge.
Yeah.
Or if you want to fill in the blank, that's a certain kind of nudge.
Yeah.
You're going to be more hesitant.
Of course, yeah.
Yes, blank. So if you can't even avoid the problem, why not optimize it with the best outcome? No matter what you do with the nudge.
Yeah, so a lot of things are nudges. I don't think everything is. So I think there are ways to ask a question that are not. And I think you can present options in a nudging way. But you're right. In many cases, in the case of referendums, for example, that's also very clear sometimes when you have referendums and the way you ask the question can nudge people in a direction or another. I think we should try to eliminate that as much as possible. But it's not necessarily a problem again. I mean, I think in the case of organ donation, I think it would be fair to just ask a very clear question without nudging people into doing certain things. My problem here is with the lack of transparency, really. I think there's potentially, I mean, I haven't mentioned it, but so a lot of people have said it's manipulative. And the problem with nudges is that they manipulate people, and without people being aware of it. I think if you're being nudged into donating organs, even if that's the best thing to do, objectively, I think there's an issue as well. I think it would be more acceptable to maybe have a law that says you should donate your organs. If you don't want to, you need to make it clear or something like this. I don't think that's not a nudge. That's not a nudge, because if that's a law that says this, well, this is the way it is. If you don't want it, then please let us know. That's not a nudge. Well, I'm not really familiar with the way they ask that question exactly. Do you know? In case of in this case. Yeah. Yeah.
But in other countries, the opposite, and they get better organ donation, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But you're just saying, let's just make a law that says yes, and then you have the option to say no. That's just like the same as the default in those countries.
So the default situation is aims at having more donations, right?
That's how you do it.
Yeah.
In America, our default ends up with less.
Yeah.
In other places more. So
do you think in America the default is nudging people into
saying no? Yeah.
Into saying no? Okay. That's interesting. I mean, I wasn't really familiar with this. So I guess there are motives for that. I'm not sure what they are, but yeah, if it's only a matter of how the question is phrased, that is a nudge. I agree with you, but I still think it's quite different from saying there is a law about something, and then if you disagree, you'll have to go through this process, which is maybe a bit long, maybe a bit difficult. For example, if we said everyone must donate, it's the default, and then if you don't want to, you have to go through something a little bit difficult. That's a form of nudging, but I think it's more acceptable than just phrasing a question a certain way. If that makes sense. No, I mean, I agree that it's difficult to, even people who talk about nudges don't really agree on what counts as a nudge. For example, Sustein says a GPS is a nudge. A lot of people say it's not. So there are also debates on what counts as a nudge. If a question about organs is phrased a certain way to influence people, I think that would be a nudge. But if there's a clear law about it, and if to go against that law, you need to go through a difficult process, that's less of a nudge, I think.
I was thinking I think it would be unsurprising to expect that. Even if you're a critic of nudges, you can say, look, some nudges are relatively inoffensive, but whether a nudge is overall good or not will depend on the choice architect in question, the government in question, the rational capacity of the people who are going to themselves, right? That's one of the things that applies that time I have it. the big question I'll ask again, but there's some people critique nudges not because of the words, because the very same problems regarding human rationality causing the nudge to create themselves. So I just think it could still make for a very interesting paper to critique that as well. So saying, yeah, they're not all bad, sometimes they're fine. It should be, I'm not sure if this is a problem for others, but I know for some people, they get into a mindset where they criticize something that has to be everything about it. Oh, essentially, whereas could it be, this is a cute little thing I've never seen it before, and then, I guess that's what mildly annoying as a village, but then you get the hard one, is that could be people are arrogating for themselves the right to make alterations to choice architecture. Could be that people are wrong about the higher order relations, like metastatic issue people are really consider. They might not be rational enough to make themselves.
Yeah.
You can have a taxonomy of nudges are so very problematic in terms of discarding. Maybe they track the long-term issue.
No, I agree. It's a little bit what I'm trying to do. I'm not like completely against nudges. I just think we should be cautious. Again, yeah, those on the top are pretty harmless and pretty funny. Yeah, I think the level of transparency would be a condition. I think a non-transparent nudge is better than is worse than a transparent one. And obviously their level of benevolence, but that also raises problems on what is benevolent, what is who designed the nudge, and what are their intentions, and so on. But yeah, I agree. I'm not completely rejecting them. I think we should use them with moderation.
Thanks. So I'm curious about the way that nudges and autonomy might line up with the system 1, system 2 distinction. Obviously, I'm also not a medical scientist, so
yeah.
I'm just kind of granted for the sake of argument that there are these systems between reflexive thinking and instinctive thinking. One of the points that you brought up was that autonomy or autonomous decisions are more like the system 2 reflective thinking. And if I understood you right, you were saying that maybe potentially raised a problem with the idea that nudges were still libertarian that way. It seems to me that it actually strengthens that case. Because if it's something like if you're only acting on the system 1 side, then you're not even engaged in the question of no matter what you choose, it's not autonomous. It's not reflective the right way, or something like that. But if the nudges only kick in when you're only relying on the system 1 thing, and as soon as you take that reflective step and make an autonomous decision, you cease to be swayed by these little, subconscious biases, then that would seem like that would just sort of illustrate or show how the nudges don't undermine your autonomy.
So you mean the nudge is triggering system 1, and then you react to the nudge. But how are you? I'm not sure. So you're saying it's more libertarian friendly to accept that they rely on system 1 mechanisms.
Well, I was saying if they only rely on system 1 mechanisms,
yeah,
and your view of autonomy brings it with system 2,
yeah,
then it seems like nudges are compatible with autonomy. It's the question of whether autonomy is being violated doesn't even arise.
Oh, yeah. Sure. Yeah, of course. You can live an autonomous life and sometimes have system 1 actions, but I don't know if those actions would qualify as autonomous actions, in fact. Yeah. But so, I mean, also,
we move to the level of autonomous action where I reflect what are my true desires.
Yeah.
Then suddenly I'm no longer bound by those budgets.
Yeah.
By the assumption of the system.
Yeah. But I think you still need to be able to do that, right? And I'm a bit worried that, again, if you rely on them, then you would lose that ability to reflect on your system one decisions. I mean, it might not be the case, and again, I don't really know if this is relevant in this where this is working at all, but yeah, there might be no relation between the two, and it might be completely fine, and you might be able to actually, and I think we do actually, when we interact with nudges and we respond to them, we are able to think about it, and maybe after that you'll be more able to think about those responses. But I don't know if everyone does that. First of all, I think if we use nudges so much, so often, we might completely lose our ability to reflect on whatever system one actions the nudges have produced. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's definitely an ability we have, but I think it's an ability we can lose, and that we can lose if, again, we just get into this kind of habit. But then about the libertarian argument, it's also not quite the same to have a libertarian claim about anything and to have a claim for autonomy, because they're actually two very different concepts. Typically, libertarians won't really advocate for any theory of autonomy. They're not really interested in this concept of self-government, autonomous decisions, and so on. They're more interested in what you're not stopped from doing, right? So here I'm not really criticizing the libertarian claim with my argument on autonomy. I'm giving another argument basically, because yeah, I don't, maybe I make it even more unclear, but yeah.
So the whole thing about no structural changes, quick fixes. So it seems like, right, like part of the structural problem would be that we don't act for system two or not, that we don't engage in rational thought to do that. It seems like, so let's take an example, say you're in a cafeteria line, somewhere in the cafeteria line, either put the cake there first, before that see what the cafeteria does, encouraging it to what's best for something, or you put an apple first. So the nudger would use the example there, certainly so just imagine like Joe Schmo in the cafeteria, they don't, they're a normal, rational person, but they are influenced by this change. It seems like here are the two possible options. Nudge them, and they're better off, and there's no structural change. But don't nudge them, they're not better off, there's still no structural change.
Yeah.
It seems like what they were needing for structural change was the economy work on, but that, like, so I'm not, I guess I'm not seeing why is that bad when the structural change is needed so much, whereas quick fixes at least something.
Yeah. No, I get it. I think it's the same argument for effective altruism or similar theories, where it's like we already live in a situation that produces bad outcomes. We may as well fix what we can fix without engaging in those very big structural changes. And it's better to do this than to do nothing, not engage in those changes, and also not nudge. So it's true in a way. It's true right now if we want to have a very what I would consider a short-termist vision. But in fact, effective altruism is also a long-termist theory most of the time. So I think I don't really understand how that works. But yes, the outcome is better. But I still think that it raises the question of what are we going to do about the changes that we could make, right? it's just about I think it's just about ambition. It's just about the how interested we are in educating people such that they don't make those choices in the first place. Of course, it would be long, it would be costly, but I'm wondering if that would not be more important than to just invest in those little adjustments. Little adjustments are better than nothing at all. But the problem with little adjustments is that they're here and they do some good. Because they do some good, then maybe there's no need to look at what you could do better. See? And for effective altruism, it's a little bit the same. I think that, it could be the problem with philanthropy in general. There's philanthropy, there's people who give give money to people in need. So that's good. But because there's that, then we don't need to look at the problem of poverty in general and how we can eradicate that from a structural point of view. And that's why I think from a long-term perspective, it causes more harm because it allows us the luxury of staying in this situation. But this is what I think, but I also think that you're right, that it's better to be nudged in this direction than not, if you just consider this situation right now. But I still don't think we should be satisfied with it as a project for society.
We started a little bit later. All right, there's no.
I think there's someone on. I don't know. There's someone on the chat. Finger in this question, but I don't know which one it was.
I'm Jen. I think it was Ethan's question. But I couldn't totally hear. Mostly guessing it's a finger based on your response. So I'm sorry if it just like repeats his question. But I think it's different. So anyway, first I just want to say thanks for talk. Super interesting. I'm also kind of curious about the sort of nature of the threat to autonomy via like atrophying this kind of like second system response, like reflective response. So I'm wondering like what you thought about a like what if it turned out that the like neurocognitive mechanism of nudges is such that like they're heuristical to the extent that you don't have an antecedent disposition to resist them. So if you're nudged in a particular way, you're like, oh, like, and you don't like have pre-existing values or pre-existing considered views or just mere desires that would incline you to resist being nudged in that direction, you're kind of just ambivalent. Then you get nudged in that direction. But it's always sort of in the background as a possibility that you could activate system 2. And the reason that would happen is you get into situations where you're nudged in a direction that you are disposed to resist. So that would allow for the continued, like the criterion that they be sort of non-transparent, quasi-automatic, but also resistible. And I mean, maybe you think that it should always be the case that we're using these like second system, more sophisticated, reflective cognitive capacities, but it might, I mean, arguably the cases where that's important are the cases where we would otherwise be inclined to resist. And if it just turns out that nudges are going to activate system 2 in cases where you were already going to resist, then there might not be so much of an atrophying threat in that particular regard. I just wondering what you thought about that.
Yeah, so you mean in the case the nudges trigger system 2?
Sorry. So that would only happen if you sort of were already, you weren't thinking about it. So you have all these like, offline system 2 processes that only get brought online under certain conditions. And it might be that the way that nudges work is they sort of they coast along on system 1. only insofar as you don't have like,
Just to use system 2, basically.
yeah, right.
Yeah, sure. Right. And when something when there's a decision to make that actually matters, then you use system 2. So what you're saying, and then the nudge becomes irrelevant, basically, and it's not influence you so much that you're incapable of using that system 2. Is that what you're?
Yeah,
so
that's
yeah, it's definitely possible. I think it's the case actually as we speak, right? So I don't think the damage is that bad that you're completely incapable of using your system 2 for the things that matter. Now, well, again, there's always the I think the atrophy worry, which is not something we can really evaluate at the moment. We might, maybe we'll let's meet again in 10 years and see where we are on the research on that. But no, I definitely think it's still possible to use your system 2. I just think there's something a little problematic in just saying we're going to take advantage of system 1 to help, but then you always have the option to just go back to system 2. But when it's for decisions that are of such importance as well, when we talk about pension, when we talk about health things, I think those problems are important enough for us to be willing to use our system 2 first to solve them rather than relying on the system 1. And again, I think it's only, it really shows a lack of ambition on what we think people can do, because I think we're all capable of utilizing system 2 for anything. And I don't think it's necessarily very interesting to have a society that says, okay, we're going to fix those things that that everyone could fix by themselves or together through deliberation and so on, using that. I think actually we should, it's not something I really talked about, but there's a possibility that we can also get rid of the biases and the quick thinking and all the mistakes we make through system 1, at least as much as possible. I think there's a possibility that we minimize this. That's what we do when we teach critical thinking and so on. So I think we should focus on this first, instead of taking advantage of those very mechanisms to make us choose something that produces a better outcome. So that would be my view. Now, I agree with you. We can still, I think, move from system 1 and system 2 when we're still able to make those reflective decisions. But I think we should focus on them more, rather than saying, okay, this is the way it is, and I'll just utilize that for a better outcome. Is that answering your question?
Yeah. I might shoot you an email about it, but thanks so much. That's helpful.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so I think we're just about out of time, so please join me with more thanking our speakers.
And yeah, we have a public lecture this day next week online, and hopefully no more technological mishaps. So please consider joining us for that. All right, so thanks.